My name is Bakr Madden, shabazz. I'm 44 years old and I'm of Jamaican heritage.
And could
My first memories as a child, what I can vaguely remember was doing a lot of creative activities out in the backyard. And I think what it was, because I was born in Barry, I come to live with my father when I was about 2 years old. And at that particular time, I used to work a lot, so unfortunately, I was left in the house on my own. And used to have like older black people from the community used to come over just to check on me. And I always used to remember playing outside in the backyard, digging up worms and spiders, etc. So it was quite a creative activity that I was engaged in. A lot of play seemed to be the case as well with my early experiences as a child. I think I just used to make them up as I go along, because what was common at the time was that because we were like a small minority group that was living in Cardiff, most of the black children couldn't play with the white children. So I actually found myself playing on my own. And this took place for a good few years, up until I was about 7 or 8. I can never understand why that was the case, because when I used to look outside the window, I could see younger kids playing with each other. But it's one until I got older and I went to school that I began to realize the reality. My school experience was positive up until I was about 7 and it became negative. I was brought up in more or less an extended family. So basically, it was my father and it was my grandmother and her husband as well. So there was like 3 generations of people in the home. And what I actually found was that it was quite a loving type of experience. But my school experience really was okay up until I was about 7. I spoke Jamaican patois normally. It was just normal because obviously that's what my father spoke, because he came over here in the mid 60s. Is what my grandmother spoke, and her husband, who came in the late 50s. So even though I spoke Jamaican, I knew nothing about Jamaica. When I went to school, the teacher basically said that I was difficult to understand, because obviously the Jamaican patois was quite different to the standard so-called English at the particular time. So I found myself in conflict with the teacher, where they really couldn't understand me. And I think that is probably what caused that conflict, because of me being different and not standing out, obviously, in my linguistic expressions. Yes, there was a lot of questions asked, because obviously they knew we were different from a physical standpoint. As far as attitude and behavior was concerned, I presume they thought we were the same. And obviously, when we started to correlate information, especially in the school playgrounds, and they started to see, differences, when we'd say, well, look, we'd have to get our own beating instrument, for instance, which was a belt. They thought that was quite sadistic. And obviously, being, beaten as a young child for forgetting things, they thought that was sadistic. But for us, it was normal behavior, it was normal attitudes, and it was something that we began to rationalize. Yeah, and when I used to hear from their perspective of their own experiences, I felt it was quite strange, because what was very common growing up, see, a lot of the white kids obviously was living in this city. It was very common for them to answer back, to their parents, which was like a no-no. You didn't say no, you didn't answer back. So that was quite strange. And I think trying to bring those type of behavioral attitudes at home, obviously that was nipped in the bud, straight away. So yeah, it was different. But as I started to, what do you call it now, interact with them more and more, I started to realize there were differences in practices and attitudes. Yes, there was a lot of responsibilities, because what was quite common at the time, when Caribbean people came here between the 1940s and the 1970s to settle in this country, what you found was that it was a dual working household. So there was hardly any such thing as a stay at home mum. Yeah, the mothers were here to work, the fathers were here to work. So for me, I felt I was neglected in a sense. And when I speak to most people of my heritage about this issue. It's something that has greatly affected us in some way because our mothers were not stay-at-home mums at all. They had to go out to work. Yeah, our father has to go out to work. So literally, what we found ourselves doing was, bringing ourselves up. Occasionally, elder people within the community would come over and check upon us, etc., etc. But we did miss out on that maternal paternal attachment. My upbringing became strict when I was about 4 or 5. Very strict. It was a traditional Jamaican strictness because I had a lot of responsibility. I had to cook. Obviously, my grandmother taught me how to cook when I was 7. It was something that I had to do because there was younger siblings, which were actually on the scene. So I had to have that type of responsibility. So by the time I was 8, 9, and 10 years old, well, I had to cook meals for the whole family for when they came home, that they can actually eat something. So I was given early responsibility. I think maybe too much. No, I think it may have been a bit too much, but it was certainly advantageous for me as I got into my adulthood. Yeah, I think that was the case. My grandparents, yeah, I suppose there was a lot of violence because there was this concept of righteous licks, if you can't hear, you must can't feel, and, me'll teach you how to remember things, or me say things once, me just mean it once. So it was that type of association I could remember with my so-called upbringing, that form of strictness, and that thing of staying on top of things, having an open ears, having open ears at all times. So it was difficult. But I think as time went on, it became normal and natural. I suppose we rationalized that behavior to such an extent that we actually thought it was normal. Being beaten, I suppose, with pots and pans and kettles and things like that. We actually thought that was normal until we went to school and we were speaking to all the white kids. And they were telling us that they were getting beaten by slippers. And we were thinking, like a slipper? So we actually thought it was a normal type of upbringing. But unfortunately, that was the type of upbringing which was very common in the Caribbean at that particular time. And it was something that they transcended and obviously transplanted upon us. Right. The expectations weren't as high. Basically, what was very common, I suppose, and I suppose in most Caribbean households as well, go to school, do good in school and get yourself a good job. It was that type of attitude. But what was unfortunate about the attitude was that they expected the school to do the whole educational type of critique. So basically, the education was left to the school. Our socialization was left to the school. Preparing us for the employment sector and for the labor market was left to the school. Yeah, all their job basically was to work, try to keep their homes intact, try to bring up their children. That was what was important to them. But other things, I suppose, they left it to the school. It was restricted. We had to try and find an excitement because my father did pretty well, especially coming to the late 70s because he became a landlord. So I found that my responsibilities started to extend even further. So it wasn't just cooking and cleaning, carrying out those domestic duties when my stepmother was out working. It was also a case of looking after my siblings, washing their clothes, making sure they went to bed, etc., etc. And obviously, and what was very common as well, was to go to these accommodations and clean up after residents had left. So obviously hoovering the floor, but obviously before hoovering the floor, I had to get on my hands and knees and scrub the carpets, clean out the ovens. So I was taught, so that was my job. And I used to say, well, Dad, you're going to pay me any money? He says, well, yeah, you are going to get paid. Yeah, when you go home, there'll be food waiting for you on the table. So it was that type of thing. Yeah. My relationship with people from other cultures really came when when I was in school. Like I said, I didn't play out in the street because it wasn't really encouraged playing out in the streets because of a lot of the racial conflicts and contentiousness that was already out there. Obviously, I was boxing as well, so I used to meet a lot of people. Obviously, when I used to do my recreational sort of things. But yeah, I started to have much more of an understanding about different people's cultures then, because it wasn't just people from the dominant culture. Obviously, there was a large Chinese community at the time, a large Asian community, and then obviously trying to find a difference between them, because obviously you had people who were Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, and then you had a large Indian population that came from the Caribbean, which saw themselves as totally different. And then you had another group which were of Asian descent who were from Africa. So trying to devise and to sieve them through, a category in order to understand their backgrounds and where they come from, I think it was challenging, but it was exciting at the same time. Yeah, definitely. My first job, I think my first true job obviously was a child, obviously working in the home, etc. And obviously helping my father, who was a landlord, with his accommodation. And then my father used to work in the building trade, so going out on site with him, when about the age of 9, 10, 11, 12. So I've always known myself to work. But outside the home, I think my first job, was when I was about 12, was a paper round. That's how it began for me. And because we wasn't given pocket money, in order for us to get pocket money, we had to earn it some way. So I had to physically go out and earn my own pocket money. And then to try to teach me responsibility, you would take half of my money off me for keep or for board. I was only getting paid like £5 a week at the time, and taking £2.50 out of that really, really upset me. But he said he's there to try and teach me responsibility. Later on, when I was in school, I think it was when I left school, I went on what was known as the Youth Training Scheme, which was known as the YTS at the time, because the government at the time had scrapped the apprenticeship schemes and tried to bring in this new form of trying to train people. And it wasn't the best of training opportunities and skills that they can offer at the time, because they were exploiting us. We were being, paid, I think it was probably about 1/3 less than what another full-time person would be paid at that job. And we wasn't really appreciated, and we were promised, work at the end of the scheme, and many of us didn't get work. I had the opportunity, because I did pretty well in school, to go to Barry College, and I did a diploma in hotel and catering and in French cuisine. So I came out as a qualified chef in 1987. When I tried to get work in the city as a chef, none of the restaurants or hotels would employ me because of me being black. Right, yeah. As I was saying, in 1987, I got my diploma from Barry College in hotel and catering. When I went out to the industry, which was restaurants and hotels, to look for cooking work, I was refused a lot of jobs, and I was told by one particular manager of a corporation that I wouldn't be able to get a job if I tried, because they didn't want my black hands to touch the food. But what was very ironic, even though I was applying for these jobs, which were obviously in the newspaper, they would always have waitering jobs for me, which would come up. So I was a waiter for a good 3 to 4 years before obviously I actually got into the kitchens. I worked up to a head chef, lead chef. So what they had me doing was they had me training many chefs that was coming into the industry. I was also teaching and training chefs in hotel management, obviously kitchen skills, health and hygiene, rules and regulations. So a lot of that was left up to me to sort out. So that was my responsibility. But the unfortunate thing about that experience was that they wouldn't promote me when I needed to get promoted. And when they did promote me, they weren't paying me the equivalent to what I was promoted to do. So I did find myself being exploited. I was going to take it further in order to sort it out, but when I actually went down to a particular organisation to contest against my racial discriminational treatment in the employment sector that I was receiving, they actually looked at me as if I was a perpetrator as opposed to the victim. And it was at that particular time that I decided I wanted to speak out against the racial injustice that was taking place in this city. And that's when I started educating myself. And then obviously I became a lecturer, experience and specialising in these issues. So that's how obviously I did pretty well in school. Unfortunately, it wasn't the best experience because I did really good in infant school, junior school. When I went to secondary school, I was put straight away in the remedials when I should have been the AB band. I tried to contest that, and they basically said, well, there's nothing they can do, even though I did pass the 11 plus. They said it was up to it was teachers' discretion to put me into that particular band and see how I went. And if I did pretty well, that they would move me up. They never did move me up. So there was a lot of bashing in school, and it wasn't until it was a Jewish teacher and a white female teacher who actually had a black husband that actually fought for me in order to take my maths and English. It was called CSEs at the time, and I was able to obviously receive those qualifications that gave me instant access into higher education, or further education, I'd say at the time. Then what took place then? Obviously, I worked as a chef. My racial experience came in the early 1990s, and I don't know if you can remember back in 1991, 1992, there was going to be the quincentenary celebration of the Europeans, where they were going to actually celebrate 500 years of success. You know, when obviously they defeated the Moors in North Africa and Spain, and obviously took over the Caribbean islands and obviously the Americas at that time. And what I started listening to the radio, and I was against the celebration because obviously coming from a Caribbean or Jamaican background, I knew the type of atrocities that the European powers had actually formulated and orchestrated within these islands and within the Americas. So I'd listen to the radio all the time, and I was totally flabbergasted how there was so much money being poured into this event to celebrate the genocide of African and Native American people. So for me, I think that was really my access, I suppose, into academia, of looking at these issues, because I wanted to protest against it myself, but there was no one at the time which was aware of what I was talking about, etc. So for me, it was something that I thought, well, if I can educate myself as much about it, then obviously I can teach it to others. So I think that's how it came. I became a father during that time, when I was a teenager. Then later on, I started to study. I went back to college in the early 1990s to do what was known as computer studies at the time, because I knew that computers were going to be the new technology for the future. And then it wasn't until around about the late 1990s I decided to study theology, sociology, psychology. And obviously I used to do a lot of studies of history as a personal endeavor for myself. And then I decided then that I wanted to go to university, but I didn't know how. And Cardiff University asked me to give a talk about my personal experiences, because obviously I used to be, a bit of a lad back in the day, and obviously I became a Muslim, changed my life around, and they wanted to know the reasons why I changed. And that was the first presentation I gave. This was around about 1997, 1998. And somebody in the audience told me, well, why didn't you become a teacher? And I said, well, I thought about it, but I'm too old. At the time I was in my mid-20s. So he said basically, no, when you become a teacher, he said, you seem to captivate people, you're able to hold people's attention, and you teach with a passion. And I said, well, one, I'm too old, and two, the universities won't take me. So he was the one who told me, well, I knew the access course. Do the access course, and I will give you a straight, entrance into university. So I thought about it for a year or two. I had to brush up on my reading skills and my writing skills. And I think it was around about 2001 I decided to do the access course part-time. I did that for 3 years. And obviously I went into Exeter University to study Islamic history. And then I left there and I come to do my BS honours studies in sociology and economics at Cardiff University. And then I graduated in 2008. And during my graduation, Cardiff University decided to pay for me to go into a teacher training course so I could actually teach a lot of my passions and modules at the university eventually. So I did get a good support from Cardiff University during my undergraduate years, and they did assist me as well So basically that's my learning experience over the years. I think it hasn't been well received by minority groups, unfortunately, and that's who I've really tried to target. The people who seem to appreciate my scholarship seem to be white middle class females. Seem to be the first one, and then it seems to be white males generally, and then it seems to be those who have mixed heritage. And then when you get to African Caribbeans and Africans, they're just a few. It's just a few. And that's who the modules and the courses were originally created for. Because obviously, I teach, I've teach a few different types of black history courses, psychological courses looking on prejudice, discrimination, racism, race and genetics, looking at diversity within families, etc. And it seems to be more received from people from the dominant culture than from minority groups. And I don't know why that is. I'm not sure, because I've gone out and tried to promote it and tried to make it interesting. Maybe it's because of me. Maybe it's because of me. Maybe they're just not interested. But unfortunately, when I was growing up, there was a lot of moaning and groaning from people that, well, no one's teaching black history, no one's teaching me about my heritage. So that's something I've been able to collectivize over the years and package it and give back to them. And they still, don't come forth in order to participate in the experience. So all that moaning 20, 30 years ago was for what? For someone like me to come along to, to parcel something out to them, which they don't want. At the time, it was different, the elders, because like I said, it was my grandparents who came here originally, so there was a bit more love, more consciousness, I suppose, and because obviously they would have experienced the original hardships, especially coming here in the 1950s. Um, Obviously, my parents didn't come here to the mid 1960s, so a few things would have changed by then. But the Jamaican community at the time, obviously, because of the lot of the high amount of discrimination within this country, many of them couldn't own properties. So what they started doing was do like what was known as the partner system, where they would pool their money together. And what they would do then, each person, as soon as they get a certain amount, would actually purchase a house, and then they would go on until everyone had a house. And this is what happened. And I really started off from my grandparents' generation. By the time by the time my father's generation started the partner system, this is where you started to see where it wasn't working. As soon as the first one or two had their houses, they didn't want to continue putting the money in. So I suppose there was a lot of conflict. So you started to slowly see basically a lot of conflict between certain members within the community, a lot of backbiting and slandering, and a lot of individuality started to appear, which didn't exist there before. Especially in the especially during my teenage years, I started to see a lot of individuality starting to manifest within the Jamaican community, especially. Yeah. It was important because for me personally, the stories, my first storyteller was really my grandmother, because she used to tell me a lot of stories. This is why I know about the Maroons and the early Caribbean history. She was the one which taught me as a kid. And so for me, it was very important. It actually gave me a sense of identity, a sense of belonging. And I think marrying that type of experience or that exposure to what I was being, what do you call it now, being connected to within the wider aspects of society, such as a school and such as my peer group, I think it gave a richness basically to my experience, and maybe understand that I have probably a dual heritage, but I have a primary and a secondary sort of identity, and recognize it has its place, it has its belonging, so I think that is certainly the case. Well, my dual heritage, I would look at it from two aspects. The first is looking at it from a genetic or genealogical aspect, because obviously when I go back two generations, there's Indian, there's Chinese, there's Spanish, there's Irish. So I could do it from that aspect, yeah, from a genetic aspect. And from a social aspect, I suppose, I think it's more to do with interaction with other groups of people and maybe adapting maybe some of their cultural traits as part of my behavioral type of manifestation or expression. The Maroons originally came from Spain. They were actually Moors that came from Spain that settled in places like Jamaica. And what happened was they were the ones that helped the Spanish to go over and to find these so-called islands or these or the all so-called New Worlds. And what happened? Many of them settled there. Now the word maroon comes from the word Cimarrones, which means wild or untamed. Yeah, so it is a pejorative, terminology or definition which is used for people who wanted to come away from the hegemonic rule of the Spanish and the Portuguese. They ended up moving to the mountains, and as the Spanish started to increase the slave population within the Caribbean islands, many of the people, many of the slaves that came in would run to the mountains and settle there. And obviously the Maroons fought, obviously the Spanish. The Spanish couldn't enslave them. And they ended up defeating the British because the British took over the island of Jamaica around about 1655. And this was during the time of Oliver Cromwell. It was Cromwell's forces that literally took the island off the Spanish. And because I can say we because I am a Maroon, I'm a descendant from those people. And what happened was we defeated the British in round about approximately 1737, 1738. And Kudju signed a treaty with the British, but unfortunately the treaty basically said if any person from any part of the island would migrate there, they would have to send them back. And then this is where we get the likes of Nani the Maroon as well. She was another Maroon leader. She was against the Treaty of Kudju because she believed that, it shouldn't be just the Maroon people who should be free. She believed that all people of African descent on the island should be free. And so that's how it came about. So that built into the Jamaican people a sense of pride, and obviously that is what instigated, obviously the Haitian Revolution, which was probably the most successful slave revolution in the whole of the Caribbean islands. And it was the only country in 1803 that abolished slavery in its totality, socially, politically, and economically. From its shores. No other country could have bragged about that reality except for Haiti. And obviously since then Haiti has suffered because it was a beacon of freedom for the nations, and obviously the European nations have made sure it suffered since then because of that successful rebellion against, during the Napoleonic Wars. So that's how that really came about. Yeah, we do have that problem. We have this problem which is referred to as pigmentocracy. And what it basically is that your color determines your social standing, your social status. And unfortunately, this was something which was integrated into the Caribbean islands by our so-called overseers, which would have been the British. And what would happen was they would favor the lighter skins over the darker skinned people. And what would take place eventually was that we would internalize those type of attitudes and thinking because we had the Scottish, the Welsh, the English or the Irish blood, that we were better than those darker Africans, which came much later, who had the pure African blood. And that basically became a problem, especially when many of them started coming to this country. Because many of them would have been considered light-skinned or white in the Caribbean island, they were in for the shock when they came to this country, and they were reminded that they were black. Yeah. So sooner or later, so they had to come together. It's through circumstances, political or social circumstances, that the lighter skinned people literally had to get together and recognize their own ancestry and who they were. Pigmentocracy is something that is rife within the Caribbean community, not just amongst the Jamaicans, all Caribbeans. The lighter you are, the better you seem to be, you seem to fare within the economic structural system. Especially if you go into, when you go into the higher up echelon of the upper class, middle class, upper class, such as lawyers, solicitors, barristers, judges. They all primarily seem to be lighter skinned. The people in the political system or the political arena as well are light skinned. Yeah, so this demarcation seemed to have been established, obviously, by the British. And if you go to the French islands as well, or the Spanish islands of the Caribbean island, or the Dutch islands, you see the same game being played. Yeah, and we all know, in every language, there's this saying, what you call it now. Uh, if you're white, you're all right. You know, if you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're brown, stick around, and if you're black, stay back. And I think it was from from those type of paradigms, it created this type of pigmentocracy, which exists amongst lighter skin and darker skin Caribbean people in this city. Well, I think it's fading away because miscegenation is becoming more common now. I would say up to 2/3 of black males now are having children with women from outside the community, primarily white women. And but what's happening is that this association to blackness rather than whiteness. So we seem to have taken a turn in another direction now, and but the pigmentocracy aspect don't really exist amongst the light skins and the dark skins who were born in this country. It seems to be primarily amongst those who came from the Caribbean, between the 1940s and the 1970s, who actually came here and settled here. I was a boxer for 10 years. I won the Welsh Championships. I came running up twice as well in the Welsh Championships as a schoolboy. I was also the first Afro-Caribbean black boxer to be selected for Wales on 2 separate occasions. So obviously I defended my country. Not successfully though, obviously I lost, but the fact of being selected, for to fight for Wales for the international arena was an accomplishment. By the time I was 16, I decided to give up boxing because I think at the time Frank Bruno was like the main boxer at the time. And I can see that there was a lot of people who wanted to make a lot of money off me, and there was no way I wanted that. And I wanted to try to preserve my identity and to have a brain at the end of it. So I decided to leave boxing and to occupy my spare time. I went to kickboxing, and I did that for about 15 years. And in 1993, I became the national champions in kickboxing, and I gave it up around about 1995 then, and decided to go, more primarily into my studies. So yeah, I did pretty good with sports, mainly contact sports. And I think coming from the household I came from, where there was a lot of discipline, physical discipline, I suppose it was, boxing and kickboxing was more of a cathartic experience, trying to channel out that form of aggression that may have been repressed within our household. So that's what it was used for. I think the most important for me living in Cardiff, I think for me it's a diversity, and especially being a lecturer for Cardiff University now, because I have inside information about the different ethnic groups and nationalities, know the differences amongst them, and I think yes, very advantageous, because when other people from other cities come here, they really don't understand the dynamics and how knowledgeable the people like ourselves can be about the ethnic diversity amongst people. Yeah, I think Cardiff was a thing. For me, I think personally, Cardiff, out of all the main seaports, Cardiff seemed to be the most successful for for treatment, I suppose, for a lot of minority groups, especially black people, because that's one of the reasons why my grandfather came here. Because my grandfather originally went to the States. That's where a lot of Caribbeans went. But because of racial segregation in the 1950s, he decided to come here. Now, the reason why he came here, because his younger brother was already settled here in Barry, he used to work in Barry Docks. And he wrote my grandfather a letter in the States and said, listen, when you come to Wales, things are much better for black people in Wales. We're treated with a bit more respect, there's a bit more dignity. And obviously my grandfather left, the States, came straight here. Obviously he settled in Barry until he died a few years ago. But I think, listen to many of the stories that he told me when he was alive. It seemed that Cardiff seemed to be very, very accommodating for its diversification and its variety in the amount of ethnic groups and nationalities that lived in a close proximity with one another. So I think that's one of the reasons, yeah. And it's been different because you've got your good and your bad in all people, to tell the truth. But generally, looking at the diversification, with the black community, for instance, I think that, especially when I look at the relationship scenario of black males with white females, that has certainly proliferated, especially over the last 20 years. And it's become normal now. Back in the day, it was actually difficult. Women were being thrown out, rejected, displaced from their families, etc. Kids had nothing to do with the white side of their family because they didn't want nothing to do with them. That has certainly changed. So I think, and I've seen that change in my lifetime, so I can see things have gotten better to some extent, where those people with those type of old or ignorant mentalities have come to adjust to this new situation. And know it's quite normal and natural because you can't help who you fall in love with, and I think that is the reality and the advantageousness of what has come out of Wales. Well, I think it's in their blood. I think since the transatlantic slave trade, they're shakers, they're movers. There's no doubt about that. We were very expressive people, especially when it comes to song and dance music, and I think it transcends itself into us voyaging and migrating to other places, trying to look for our home. I think we're looking for our home. I think that's what we're really and truly looking for, because many of them which went to Jamaica, they would see Jamaica as their place of birth, but not really their home. And I think that's one of the main reasons, along with obviously the economic stability which they wanted through these form of migrations, where they wanted to establish. They wanted to actually, seek out a home, a place where they would be respected, they would be acknowledged, and they would be appreciated. I think that is one of the reasons why, they ended up establishing themselves under that sort of banner. Oh, definitely, that's always been there. I think because people use the word multiculturalism or more plural society, it camouflages that reality. Plural society or multiculturalism just means there's a diverse amount of people living in close proximity with one another. It doesn't mean they have opportunities and access now to services, to the labour market, to housing. Yeah, and I think we need to make this distinction between both. Just because we're living here doesn't mean that we have access or instant opportunities into these things. And for me personally, I've certainly experienced it. So it is something that is ongoing. And I think for me personally, because I appreciate and I love my blackness, I think that in itself can be considered threatening to certain establishments, because I'm not going to sell out. I'm not going to tone myself down. I know to speak, I know to articulate myself, yeah, but I am happy and I'm proud to be black, and I've always acknowledged that. I'm not ashamed of it, So I think that's what it's based on. Equality. I have a problem with the word equality. I like to look at the word equitability. People should be treated according to their needs. Yeah, because when you do this thing of equality, you're giving everyone in the same. It's just like giving everyone the same glove and hoping that they can all fit into it, and it's just not the case. I think so. Treating people according to their needs is a better way of doing things, and I think the British government and the Welsh government have overlooked this reality. Not distinguishing equality from equitability. And so for me personally, I think it's important for us to look at the individual and the collective needs of people, a group, and judging them and trying to associate with them on those principles and trying to develop them on those principles as well, rather than having this one glove fits all sort of scenario, or everyone could come under this umbrella and they're all going to be treated the same, because it's impossible. Because even in the household, if you have children, if you've got 2, 3, 4 children, you cannot treat them all the same. They all have their individual needs. and we treat them according to their needs. And the rule does not change when you get to the wider aspects of society. It's just we decide to suppress that, yeah, and try to come with something else and try to impose it on people, which it just doesn't work. If we're looking at a slave mentality, I think the best thing to look at is take it back to the beginning when slavery actually started. And we have to look at the social constructs, those type of cultural practices we had before they were stripped away from us. So obviously the first genocidal move was basically to split us from our family. So that was the first thing if we look at that. So there's the aspect of dislocation. And the other thing, in order to reinforce our dislocation, was obviously to take off our clothes. So we landed in the so-called New World naked. Then we were rejected. Then we were imposed a different language. Obviously, so we had to forget our African linguistic tongues. And then our customs were taken from us. And then our norms, our morals, our value system, our belief system. So all of these things are taken away. Now, once you strip these things away from a person and you put them into an alien environment, that environment becomes hostile for them and they become hostile to the environment. You know, it's like someone is like having your mind changed or washed, basically, and not knowing whether to go here or there. And I think this mentality has been transmitted from one generation to the next without them realizing what type of effects it would actually have. Whether it was through discipline, through the beatings, whatever the case may be. But it's certainly been transmitted onto the next generation through the process of socialization. And I think if we look into the 21st century now, we can see that form of dislocation, detachment, sometimes from ourselves, sometimes from our family, sometimes from the main group, sometimes from the ethnic group. Yeah, so it leads from one thing to another. And that, I think, what has caused is like mine to become like a failure to some extent within the black community, because they don't appreciate it's about, because once your value system and your moral system is being taken away from you, your values are going to be elsewhere, your moral system is going to be elsewhere. So what happens is when yours is parceled and given back to you, you're going to devalue it instantly. Yeah, because you can't relate to it. You can't see, well, what significance does this have with myself in 2013? You know, we look at it from that perspective. So definitely, you know, we could go much longer, but that's basically what happens when you're stripped away from those social constructs, your language, your belief, your morals, your customs, your norms, your values, and your mores. Once you're stripped away from these 7 principles, you're a nobody. And you have to take on the belief system, the moral system, the customs, the norms, the values of someone else's. And then you don't even recognize yourself. And then instantly you devalue yourself. So anything that comes from you or you've created or you've developed, you're going to devalue instantly. And that's certainly what's happened. Right, I wasn't brought up religiously. I was sent to church, but my parents weren't religious at all. I always enjoyed religion because obviously religion was something which was at school, which was obviously taught at school. And that spiritual awareness, that spiritual reality was something I had to have, I suppose, because obviously when you come from a home which was abusive, I suppose, physical, verbal abuse, mental abuse, which was continuous, you had to have an escape. So there had to have been a God. There had to have been someone who was listening to your cries. There had to be somebody there who was protecting you when sometimes the hidings or the abuse subsided, you know. So that sort of inner belief was, you know, was slowly establishing itself in me. And I think when I started to look for something, I wanted to look for something which was really, really strict, really strict for myself, because because of the type of constraints that I had in the home, when I was given my freedom, I just ran riots. So for me, I had to find the religion which I felt at the time was the most strictest and to put me in line. Because I would have either ended up dead, I would have either ended up addicted to drugs, or I could have ended up in prison. Because that's the only 3 ways I would have went. And I was full of anger. Even though I was working and stuff, I was still full of anger, and vengeance and stuff, which I wanted to take out on other people. So I needed to try to calm myself down and try to, to adopt a religion which would help me out in times of difficulty, and to see, the black from the white. You know what I'm saying? So yeah. So that's what it did for me, basically. Well, I think Islam, just like most religions, is misunderstood. And I think sometimes what you find with some groups of people, unfortunately, is that when they've gone around the world and perpetuating atrocities on other groups of people, and these group of people who do not have the same religion as them want to develop themselves, they actually find that group of people and their religion as being a threat, as if we're going to use the same sort of templates that they use to develop themselves in order to try to wipe them off the earth. And I think this is the wrong way to look at things. I think sometimes, we have to understand how the West was built. It was built upon theft, pillage, rape, exploitation, yeah? And religion was used as a tool, even though I don't agree that religion was saying this. Religion was used as a tool to justify this behavior. So they were able to look at themselves on a Sunday and to say, well, look, yeah, this is okay. I can go back to my atrocities from Monday to Saturday. But what has taken place now, I suppose, with the decline of Christianity in the West, and there's a rise of like what they call Eastern religions, more people get into spirituality, yoga, yeah, with Islam increasing as well, and with other people bringing in different types of religion. I think that the dominant culture feels it under threat and that people want to take over their system and stuff. But that's only because of what they did to other people's systems. Two groups of people don't think the same. Yeah, I think this is an important thing that we must give out to the dominant culture, because you may have caused atrocities and genocide on a large scale for maybe 400 to 500 years. It doesn't mean that those people now want to build themselves, want to perpetuate those same crimes. They just want to develop. They just want the simple things that you want or what you've got, but they want to do it peacefully, and they want to do it with assistance and help. I don't. The clashes are there, but I don't see myself being in the middle of it. They certainly exist, there's no doubt about that. But I think it's because of what I personify that don't bring me into that conflict. Because I suppose maybe darker than the average person, I might be big, I don't take mucking around. So I think for me, it's skipped around me and it's being expressed and displayed, yeah, towards other groups of people at other places. So I don't see that as an experiential form of surfacing for myself.
And
Yeah, I think the museums could do a bit more for multiculturalism, because multiculturalism should be seen in relation to time and space, not a dominant culture, and we're going to try to integrate you into it. Black people have been here since the beginning of time. This is a historical fact. This is an archaeological fact. The first people here, if you go to places like North Wales, they're even digging up every other day or every other month or every other year craniological measurements that resemble African people. So we know the original Africans of Wales, England, Scotland, Ireland, yeah, were black. So this, these sort of issues and these sort of things should be put out in the museum for them to ask themselves the question, who are we now in relation to the people who preceded us into this country, rather than look at them as a dominant culture and we are like the Johnny come laters. Yeah, because there had to have been a dynamic. There must have been some multicultural conviviality that took place between darker skinned people and obviously the lighter skinned Celtic people, yeah, which lived maybe, thousands of years ago. And that type of dynamic, if we can show multiculturalism, not just from more of a contemporary aspect, but from an antiquitous aspect, and marry them both together, you will have more realism, I suppose, in the museums. And I think this is the way, I think that's the best way to go. I think they have to realize there's more than just song and dance. There's more than just singing and dancing. Yeah, there's other forms of achievement, accomplishments, and contributions that we have made as a nation, as a group of people. You know, and we have to look at literature. We have to look at art, and we have to look into these aesthetic realms that Europeans have critiqued for themselves and tried to find our own form of expressionism within those realms. And I think if they look at it from that perspective and try to diversify their mind in that realm, I honestly think that I think the museums would probably do more, and I think they would appreciate what they have brought to this country, what they are bringing to this country now, what they brought back then, and how it's being displayed and appreciated by these establishments of historical authority. Yeah, definitely.